Hello, I'm Sujatha Raman. I'm at the Center for Public Awareness of Science. I'm going to be speaking today about some cross-cultural stories on interactions around science and science communication. I'm speaking here from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, cultures with a long history of storytelling and of storytelling as a way of transmitting knowledge through generations. And I would like to keep that in mind as I acknowledge the custodians of and the traditional owners of this land, because I hope we come back to this issues of custodianship, how knowledge is transmitted through culture, and what it means for science communication. Okay, so I've got two maps there, which as somebody speaking to you from the Northern Hemisphere, I am used to trying to sort of change people's perceptions in quite a metaphorical way by putting up a picture of an upside down map. Now, those of you who are here in Australia may not be that unfamiliar. Some of you may have seen the other projection, what is called the Peters projection, which is something that has been very influential in thinking about how we represent a flat surface, a round surface, a sphere on a flat surface. And the reason I've tended to use these examples of maps until now have been fairly for kind of metaphorical reasons, right? Maps are important because they represent kind of conventions of how we understand the world, how we represent the world, and they serve as a kind of reminder that the ways that we get accustomed to in representing the world may not be the only ones. And certainly the history of map making, I think, has some important lessons for us in that regard. But one of the stories that I was told when I moved to Australia, which was in 2018, was that maps can have some quite significant material impacts in communicating science. So it appears, and this is a story I've been told, that the British settlers assumed that coming from the north, where if you were embarking on house building, you would look for the most beneficial aspect, which would be a south-facing house. And I'm told that when British settlers moved to Australia, this is what they had in mind when they embarked on programs of house building in the Southern Hemisphere. So wow. So these things, the conventions, the tacit assumptions, they can reach quite far in terms of their impact, their practical impact on material outcomes. And I hope we can keep that in mind as we think about the significance of cross-cultural engagement and the need for cross-cultural engagement around science and scientific issues. Okay, so I want to start with an example which, if you like, conclusively demonstrates the need for being aware of different cultures, being aware of different languages before you try and communicate messages that are informed by science, before you try to communicate any messages, obviously, on a national stage, but certainly anything that's informed by expertise, by scientific knowledge. So the example I have here is from the communication of information advice that we've been given around the pandemic, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly information about social distancing, physical distancing, and so forth, but also mask wearing. And here you see, this is a story from the ABC in Australia, basically kind of highlighting that some of these messages, they tried to reach different migrant communities, different language. They were aware that people spoke different languages in Australia. Australia is one of the most multicultural countries. So they were aware of the need to recognize and communicate in different languages. But the problem is they got it completely wrong. They messed up in quite fundamental ways. So for example, this story highlights how some of the translations were actually nonsensical. Basic questions: do I need to wear a mask? Some of the ways in which questions like this and the advice was translated into local languages were completely nonsensical, right? And you can imagine, you can take a good guess at why this happened. The lesson from this, we might say, it's a very kind of everyday example, but the lesson from this is clearly that if you're trying to translate messages to diverse cultures, if you're trying to translate messages that are informed by science, you have to think of your audience. This is the basic lesson, the fundamental issue in communication, and certainly in science communication, which is about knowing your audience and minding the gap between your assumptions and the background assumptions of your audience. So that's, pretty obvious, pretty fundamental kind of lesson. The need to know what language you're engaged in. So, for example, in this case, apparently there were the same flyer mixed up two different languages, Farsi and Arabic. The assumption was, yeah, these languages have similar script, and so they must be the same. So you can only imagine, how did experts go about actually doing these translations? Who did they speak with? Did they speak with people with native knowledge or native speakers of these languages? Again, pretty obvious lesson, and one I think that should be quite uncontroversial for us to keep in mind when it comes to science communication. But what I want to maybe offer or argue and have you maybe think about is that while minding the gap, knowing your audience is clearly, very important, should be uncontroversial. But what I want to maybe ask you to think about is that maybe science communication in a cross-cultural vein is partly also about drawing attention to the kinds of knowledge we produce in the first place. What kinds of knowledge do we produce, and for what kind of society? Who is involved in producing this knowledge and disseminating or communicating this knowledge? And when I say communication of knowledge, I mean, I want to focus in particular on expert knowledge. So I'm not talking about the kinds of things that, any of us might you might get a message on your WhatsApp or something, and you might say, it appears that, coronavirus didn't actually originate from Wuhan, or from a wet market in Wuhan, for example. There's this, alternative theory about where it originated from. So you might see a message, and you might circulate it to your friends. I'm not talking about the circulation of that kind of knowledge. I am talking about the circulation of what might be described as expertise, expert knowledge, which is characterized by some level of systematicity. So in other words, in thinking about cross-cultural issues, we often talk about this as expertise is informed by knowledge systems. And there are different knowledge systems across the world. They may have features in common. All cultures, for example, have some way of counting, some form of mathematics, for example. And it would be interesting to think about how different cultures, when they come into contact with each other, how they actually engage with each other on different methods or different knowledge systems or different ways of counting. So what I'm thinking about here is something that's much more systematic, that's a bit more grounded, and a bit more than kind of forwarding a message that you might receive on social media or something like that. So I want you to, hopefully by the end of this talk, we'll think a little bit more, we'll have a few more ingredients to think about this argument that I want to make. And in order to make this argument, I'm going to appeal to an example from popular culture. So I'm speaking barely a few days after the very sad death of Chadwick Boseman, a very famous Hollywood star, the star of the film Black Panther, died at a very young age of 43. And I want to sort of draw attention to a speech that Chadwick Boseman gave at an awards function. And it's a short speech. It's about 2 minutes or so long. So I want us to kind of listen to that, and then we'll come back to what we can take from this speech.
When I think of going to work every day and the passion and the intelligence, um, the resolve, the discipline that everybody showed. I also think of two questions that we all have received during the course of multiple publicity runs. And one is, did we know that this movie was going to receive this kind of response? Meaning, was it going to make billions of dollars? Was it going to make $1 billion? Was it going to still be around during this award season? And the second question is, has it changed the industry? Has it actually changed the way this industry works, how it sees us? And my answer to that is to be young, gifted, and black. We all know what it's like to be told that there is not a place for you to be featured, yet you are young, gifted, and black. We know what it's like to be told to say there's not a screen for you to be featured on, the stage for you to be featured on. We know what it's like to be the tail and not the head. We know what it's like to be beneath and not above. And that is what we went to work with every day. Because we knew not that we would be around during award season and that it would make $1 billion, but we knew that we had something special that we wanted to give the world, that we could be full human beings in the roles that we were playing, that we could create a world that exemplified a world that we wanted to see. We knew that we had something that we wanted to give. And one thing I do know, but did it change the industry? I know that.
Okay, I've apologized about cutting off Chadwick Boseman in his full eloquence. Every time I listen to that, it gives me sort of goosebumps. But I want to draw your attention to what this actor says just towards the end of the speech, right? So he says, yeah, he's quoting this famous song from Nina Simone, to be young, gifted, and black, right? To be young, gifted, and black, and in this case, you know, be represented more widely in Hollywood movies, in action movies, in you know, where you've got a superhero, but a superhero who's, you know, almost never black. So there was something revolutionary that the film achieved, and you know, numerous people have written about it, by putting a black actor, putting an African American at the center, and allowing him to speak in an African accent. You know, doubly revolutionary in a way. But what I want to draw your attention to is the point that he makes about what he and others like him have to offer the world, have to offer all of humanity, right? All of us. And I want us to keep that in mind, because one of the reasons why the film like Black Panther and certainly Chadwick Boseman's own career is seen as so important in the history of cinema is because it's not just a matter of you know, black people being out there to represent themselves, right? That's certainly a huge part of it. And if you read the commentary that a number of African Americans have made on him, on his legacy, you know, obviously that's a huge part of it. But what I want to argue and what I want to draw your attention to, just referring back to his most eloquent words, is that at the end of the day, this kind of representation, this kind of diversity of representation is important also for the rest of us, for everyone, right? For the wider, the greater good, the public interest, the global good, if you like. And I want us to keep that in mind, because when we think about the exemplars of cross-cultural science communication, I think at the end of the day, this is the game at the end of the day. This is the holy grail. This is the prize, right? Representation of diverse voices in science communication, with an expectation that this would then change the kind of knowledge that's produced both in science, but that's also communicated more widely on a public stage. So I want us to keep that in mind as we look through a few examples. So just to summarize, what does cultural diversity then mean when we think about science communication and when we think about good science communication. Very briefly, a definition of culture. I'm just borrowing, there are numerous examples, numerous definitions out there. So I just want to take a very, standard definition from the social science literature, which is of culture as a distinctive cluster of knowledge, beliefs, worldviews, behavior, and objects that characterizes particular communities, right? Very, very a standard definition, if you like. One of the things that I have seen increasingly in the world of sustainability research, which is where I work, is a reference to the notion of culture as one of the pillars of sustainability. So we tend to think of sustainability as having to do with the environment. Sometimes we think of it as having to do with the economy, with societies. But there's some people have very eloquently written about culture. You can't have sustainable futures without paying attention to culture, because it's through culture and cultural action that we create shared meanings. So that's a crucial part here. And so what I want to kind of argue there is that when we think of cross-cultural science communication, we're thinking of, hopefully more productive, more respectful, but meaningful interactions between people who might represent, who might see the world in different ways, have different kind of, background knowledge. And maybe, the end goal of that is that we actually can have the production of new knowledge and new ways of communicating science. So I'm going to now just whiz through a few examples of a few stories. I'm going to tell you a few stories from the history of cross-cultural scientific communication. It's a quite diverse history. The first one is another sad one, quite much like the one that I started with. This is a story of absence of science communication or absence of communication in the process of doing science. And the example here is, again, very famous. It's been described, a few years back in Nature, in the journal Nature, and it has to do with the processes by which a cell line was created from an African-American woman in the early 1950s. She had cervical cancer. She gave her name without her knowledge or her family's knowledge to an entire cell line that was derived from her tissue, from her body. One of the things that the kind of this case reveals is that it wasn't until 25 years later that her family realized what was going on, what had happened here. They had not been told, their consent had not been asked for the retention of this tissue, let alone the patenting and the creation of the cell line. And as you can see there, the quote there from the article, this was the first time in 2013, right, quite recently. It was the first time in the very long history of the use of these cells, the HeLa cells, that scientists had sat down to kind of explain what was going on, that devoted attention to the family to kind of describe what they had done and how they were planning to and how they had been using this tissue. So here's a classic example of another example of failure, if you like, in the history of cross-cultural science communication. But I want to give you another example, again cross-cultural in nature, and I want to kind of point out here what better ways of communicating, better forms of engaging across cultures might have actually done to produce new knowledge, as I've been suggesting cross-cultural science communication can do. So this is a picture of the forest and savanna region in West Africa, Republic of Guinea, which has been widely described as a biodiversity and deforestation hotspot. So basically, there's been long concern about the fact that people who live, often subsistence villagers living in these regions, have been gradually converting forest land into savanna, in order to support themselves, for grazing, and obviously, living and so forth. And so there have been long-running questions here about the forest being displaced by human action, right, by the savanna that they were creating. And here is an example of a couple of anthropologists who actually went in and, much like scientists, and I would argue essentially could be described as doing science, they went in and decided to talk to people living in this region. They collected different forms of data, and essentially what they found is that much of the assumptions that had been made in kind of large-scale mapping of this region at the time had been basically flawed. They had made a number of assumptions about this kind of displacement, but the work that Melissa Leach and James Fairhead did in their research, in their very grounded research, was a kind of triangulation. So they talked to people, they looked at archives, they looked at satellite images, and basically they put together a picture which seemed to suggest that, in fact, forest cover had been growing over 30 years. This was in the late 1990s. There's been a film made of this, a nice example, I think, of cross-cultural communication in practice. And it's something that was achieved by basically talking to people on the ground who had some knowledge. So 2 examples there. One to suggest what cross-cultural engagement could do. The other one, goes back into history, kind of highlights, yet another example from a kind of litany of failures, if you like. I want to move now to the more kind of contemporary era. And I want us to maybe think about, so, we have learned from doing this kind of research, from greater kind of cultural awareness of these sorts of examples. We have learned that there are ways in which the communication of science, both in popular culture, but also in places like museums, there's much to be done in terms of making them more inclusive. We have films these days, so the very famous film Hidden Figures, which told the story of African-American women in NASA who were instrumental in the fundamental work that NASA did, and the history of their contribution didn't get recognized, didn't get acknowledged until much more recently. So Katherine Johnson there, the picture, also passed away quite recently, has now come to be known and come to be acknowledged for her contribution here. The other film there, The Man Who Knew Infinity, is of an example, goes back a little bit early in the 1900s, and this is of a mathematician called Ramanujan from India, who was, basically, it's been described in the kind of history of mathematics as this kind of self-taught genius. But the story is partly about how he was both supported, but how he also encountered racism when he first moved to England to kind of publicize his contribution and to work with G.H. Hardy, a famous mathematician in Cambridge. So we're starting to have these kinds of examples of what might be possible, or the problems of exclusion, and what might be possible if we start paying more attention to including a more diverse range of voices. A work by Emily Dawson at the University of College London. She's somebody who's looked at this in the context of museums and the extent to which museums allow people from diverse backgrounds to feel included, to feel part of the story of science that's being told. Basically the argument there is that there's a long way to go in this regard. Now, I've just got a question out there. Are we doing any better than the museums in London are? Are we doing any better in Australia? I don't know. I think that's an open question. Perhaps it's something that we need to think about and we need to discuss. Okay, so as I wind down to a conclusion, I want to suggest that maybe one of the things we could be thinking about is, what could science and science communication look like if it were actually populated by a more diverse range of figures? So you could say, like, where's the Black Panther in the space of science communication? Maybe it's a space to watch, right? I don't know the answer to that, but I want to kind of throw that out there. And maybe, again, going back to where I started with the example of, being lost in translation around something as simple as messaging about COVID-19, the coronavirus, in the middle of a pandemic. Maybe it's one of those disasters that could have been avoided if we had a more diverse range of people involved in both constructing the messaging, but also publicizing them. And then, just in conclusion, I want to give you a couple of examples. These kinds of questions about diversity are things that certainly people have been starting to explore more widely. The example there is from Science Journalism. It's a magazine called Undark. And basically, they argue that science journalism that's more inclusive is actually better science journalism, or can be better science journalism. The argument there is that in the kind of science journalism program that was run at UC, University of California, Santa Cruz, having a more diverse range of people in their kind of internships meant that they were exposed to a much wider range of stories that were considered to be important examples of science, important examples that we should care about, the kind of research that we should care about. I've just put up one example there, which is about environmental pollution that affects low-income communities in Los Angeles, but there are many other examples of that kind. So again, hopefully it illustrates what I've been saying, which is that by being inclusive, being more diverse, we shouldn't be afraid that this means that it's about dilution of quality or anything. Maybe we can actually do better. And just to keep one kind of ingredient of that in mind as we watch this space in the future of science communication is the example of the interaction, which the rapprochement maybe a little bit between indigenous knowledges in different parts of the world and what we sometimes call Western science, but maybe is more accurately called modern science, because modern science has been influenced by a whole range of different cultural traditions from across the world. So maybe the term Western science is not quite accurate. But this is an example that kind of nicely illustrates what might happen if just in the production of scientific research, when you have teams of people that include not just people who are kind of mainstream, if you like, from dominant culture, but also from an Aboriginal, in this case, Indigenous background, Indigenous Australian background. So this is an example of research that was done by this kind of collaboration, and that was then publicized in the science communication landscape with that wonderful headline. It's taken thousands of years, but Western science is finally catching up to traditional knowledge. So I want to leave it there as maybe an example, maybe a little bit for us to think about what diversity might do for the future of science communication. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sujatha. I'm tossing up in my mind between asking a serious question and asking a Marvel question, because you know this is the moment of Chadwick Boseman just tragically died. He's a young guy. It's a horrific thing. But your body language just then says, please don't ask me what my favorite Marvel movie is.
Because I must say that's probably one, maybe the only one I've seen.
And that's quite all right. I hold no judgment on that. No judgment on. I guess you went and saw it, and you're like this. You understood why it was a great movie, but were you a little bit baffled by the superhero-iness of it? You can say no comment.
I mean, in that context, it totally made sense.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, superheroes, that's what they do. They save the world, and there's a real problem in this that needs to be solved, and it kind of made sense. Maybe it's just I mean, I must say, okay, so I'm used to, I have seen, it depends on what you count as a superhero movie, I suppose. Spider-Man,
Yes.
See, but some of these things, Batman and things,
Yes.
but sometimes those things are all about like the tortured individual,
Okay. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of it here, but it's much more of a community thing, it's like...
Okay.
Yeah, there's...
So, but normally the genre doesn't quite speak to you for entertainment purposes.
Probably, yeah, I can sort of dip in, maybe if I'm on a plane, but yeah, probably not.
But
this one did.
That's quite all right. That's quite all right. No, I'm not here to have a long conversation about the Marvel Cinematic Universe or about the point that you're making about superheroes. But I think a really fascinating point there that you make, of course, that representation is a critical thing in wider popular culture, but that science communication, of course, fills very critical aspects of the ways that we in society talk to ourselves about ourselves, and that diversity and inclusion are critical aspects of that. So the serious question that I want to start with is a form of diagnosis that I know you've just done there, but I just want, what caused the stuff up in the Arabic language, inadequate instructions? What do you think were the things that contributed to that failure in getting out COVID instructions? Because they're current. This is 2020. Absolutely. It's not something from 10 years ago, 20 years ago. What do you think they did right, and what do you think they did wrong?
So my sense, I mean, obviously I don't know exactly the circumstances under which those things were produced, but my sense is, these were people they wanted to do the right thing.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. They recognized, okay, you put these flyers out in English, it doesn't necessarily mean everybody's...
We can imagine 20 years ago they wouldn't have...
And they would not have done. Yeah. So absolutely, it's progress, significant progress. And I think it's just an assumption and, well-intentioned, wanting to do the right thing. So I would say in that kind of case, it's not about... not thinking even... I mean, my assumption is if you talk to the people who produced it, they would think, well, we were meeting criteria for diversity. We were taking diversity into account, right? Yeah. Cultural diversity into account. But I think it's just a little kind of detail there, which is about, you got to talk to people who know this stuff, right? Yeah. And I mean, just to give you another example, you can't assume... They might have had people maybe from a migrant background. Sometimes what happens in these things is, people, you've got one person who's maybe not white, but maybe can stand for the rest of the the non-white population, if you like. And, we know that that's not going to work. Yeah. I mean, I myself, I come from India. I know one language, one Indian language.
India's incredibly diverse country.
Yeah. And so, don't ask me anything in Hindi. I don't know. So it's supposed to be the national language, but I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's just that kind of basic cultural competence of find people.
There's a thing that I do wonder is that, how do we ask those questions? How do we ask how do we find the cultural pathways in to find the right person to say, okay, that Arabic flyer was not right. They found someone who could speak Arabic. And at what point do they find someone that says, okay, yes, but that's not going to work for you in that situation? Yeah. As a white person here, I can say, or not can say, I'm trying to process through the question of they found someone speaking out. When do they know that they don't have it adequately done? Is a challenge to find out.
Yeah, I guess I would think, I suppose my first, my instinctive response to that is that you need people if you find yourself thinking, this is just very straightforward, I can put this through, Google Translate or whatever. I don't know if that's what, I'm not accusing anyone of doing that, but if you think that's all there is to it, if you think it's like a really simple thing, then you're probably wrong when it comes to cultural diversity. You're probably making a lot of assumptions. Okay. Well, there's a good lesson. Yeah, maybe that's don't ask yourself. Maybe I should think again and talk to a few people. Or, I'd say don't assume that something as straightforward. I mean, I would say this even with, and I'm sure you know more about this, but translating COVID advice into messages in English for all of us to process. That's been hard enough.
Oh, absolutely,
right?
Of course. So even when it's coming from the dominant language of government, that is still a huge challenge to get to work with different audiences.
Yeah. So I think this is just, a little, and I might have described that as, it's everyday, it's mundane. It seems very simple, right? These are the conditions under which you wear a mask, and this is how this is where you source one, and those sorts of things, right? But obviously, I think what science communication maybe tells us is that things are going to be a bit more complicated than you assume, and you have to sort of maybe acknowledge some of that, and then still find a way of translating that into a digestible.
So I guess much of our audience might be orienting themselves to be working science communicators.
Yeah.
What do you think is the process for your first lesson there? It will be more complicated than you think.
Yeah.
Cool. What do you think is a process for either not ending up in that space or rectifying it if you do end up there? Yeah.
I think the first thing would be to try and find people who they're bound to be this day and age, right? Most migrant communities, for example, just sticking to that example, there's bound to be people who already kind of who are active in the community, in their communities. You can't, it can be tricky sometimes because, I think the history of these things show that sometimes like one group gets becomes responsible for speaking for the community.
The Arabic language group, and we know that Arabic is a very big language that's spoken in very different ways by different communities.
Yeah. So you would be. It's on the one hand, you want to seek out the people who are willing to speak on behalf of the community, and not everybody can, and the kind of bridge builders and the translators and that sort of thing. But at the same time, you probably still want to be aware that you're not just kind of, you're not just putting everything into one black box, right? Yeah. Okay, so we have ticked that, we have ticked that sort of needing to ask people from the right background. You might want to look, a little bit more widely.
I think this is the fascinating, it's kind of an epistemological challenge in the sense that the things that we don't know. And a quest always in science and in science communication to try and reduce the things that we don't know, to understand those gaps, obviously the important ones, but to try and think in this space when you have messaging, to try and think, okay, what are the things that we're not doing? Where are the gaps? So there's almost a requirement for diversity in diversity, to try and pull in ever more different perspectives.
So just to give you an example because I'm used in the UK, for example, there's a label called BAME, which is Black and Ethnic Minority. I think that's what it stands for.
I've seen that. I see that in Guardian reporting overseas, and every time I read it, I think, how did we end up in a place where that became the acronym? It really, to me, sounds like Black and Other.
And again, I think probably it was all for really good intentions. It was in the process of trying to make sure that we at least started to listen to and think about people from different backgrounds, right? But then I think the problem is that you're not just going to solve it by saying, okay, so there's white and then there's everybody else. Right? So I'm kind of an optimist, I guess, and so long as people have the right intentions, I think you can work with that. And nudge people along. I make mistakes, right? For example, I'm from one. I may not be white, but I'm going to be messing up in all kinds of ways when it comes to cultural norms of a different community, right? So one of the things I didn't realize until I came to Australia is that we capitalize Indigenous when we talk about Indigenous people and knowledge. We capitalize it. And I didn't know.
Well, the word "we" there would be aspirational. I would say that there is certainly a politics there that I don't know how many people are resisting, but conservative-minded people may not, and Indigenous people have asked that we capitalise. So there may be still people that don't. So
I guess I'm thinking we as in the
we the aspirational progressive
people.
version.
And so I wrote something, and then it was pointed out to me, and
Mm-hmm.
but luckily I don't think anyone thought I was being doing it deliberately
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
So I think it is possible. I mean, these things can be very touchy and difficult, right? Sometimes the cultural
And I think
sensitivity.
here is the difficulty in cultural sensitivity of how can we open ourselves to feedback and to growing to become a better person without responding, I didn't mean it, leave me alone, I'm trying my best.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I like, this probably doesn't answer the question, but that's why that's why we need more stories, right?
Yeah.
We need stories that are not just stories of failures or people becoming victims of dominant culture and so forth, right? That's why the Black Panther story again is such a powerful one, right? It's a story. It's a story being told by this network of African American actors, producers, the whole directors, and on their own terms.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a powerful story. It's a positive story, if you like. And I think, in a sense, that's the we are going to have all these kind of hurdles and people tripping over each other and not quite knowing what to say and so forth, and that's going to go on. But hopefully through that we will have some of spaces created for those those good stories, if you like, to come out. Because in a sense I think that's how some of this change will happen. That's why.
Yeah. I guess the final question that I just want to, what are the things, if we are becoming better at talking about some forms of diversity in science and in science communication, what do you think are either the forms of inclusion, forms of diversity, or forms of othering that we still may be doing, that we could work on, that into the future we should be attempting to address?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that strikes me certainly is that sometimes the kind of inclusion happens in a way where you kind of assume that somebody from another background, if you like, doesn't share your the kind of knowledge that you might have.
Okay. Yeah.
Or
Do you mean
there's
a sense of belittling an audience?
or I mean, maybe I think sometimes the issue of kind of local knowledge or knowledge systems can be sort of taken to kind of a perverse end, where it's sort of used to sort of make this point that you've got science and then you've got all these other knowledge systems, and if people come from a different country, they must have their own local knowledge, and but I think the fact remains that we are in a global the global society, and there's been a lot more. I think I said in my talk that what we call Western science is itself the product of Arabic influence, Indian influence. Indians apparently think everything comes from India.
Well,
but I will not make that claim.
I don't doubt many people think they have special status in global culture.
But equally, so I mean, this is a strange time for me to be an Indian and living in another country and seeing what is happening in India, where sometimes these examples of thinking about local knowledge and inclusion and so forth can be pushed to completely authoritarian, fascistic ends, right? So we need to be confident that we can call out those examples.
Well,
but then you would want to, you do it through alliances. You do it through
absolutely. And I think here's the question: the we in that is a very interesting one. What ground do I have to get involved in some debates? Some debates I have no space, and the space I could be is to listen, and that's all it should be. Yeah. Other debates, there may be roles for outsiders to play potentially. I don't know, but I think there's an interesting tension there between the hierarchies of dominance within knowledge systems and how outsiders play in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is, and it is interesting for me as well as in. So I come from India, but I've always sort of studied white cultural settings, if you
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
right? And I have not, I've not thought that to be odd. I'm the kinds of questions that I've been interested in about public good, public interest, and the relationship with science, right? In a sense, they're universal.
Well, why should any question be? If it's a question, it's not
Yeah.
odd. It's your choice.
So I haven't found that to be odd in a way. Maybe I think,
Hmm.
okay, well, the anthropologists have gone around the world studying other cultures.
Well,
so maybe there's a little bit of the. But equally, I think sometimes it may be that, we might want to be silent about certain things, or play maybe work with other people to kind of facilitate, to contribute.
Yeah.
But maybe, so for example, I've been doing some work in sub-Saharan Africa, where I think, okay, I'm not from Nigeria or Ghana or Malawi, but what do I have to contribute? But I have these fabulous collaborators, people I've worked with. They have the knowledge. There's something that I bring to it, but then it's through that collaboration that's something.
Understanding who you are
Yeah.
and what your knowledge is, and how one form of knowledge will never solve a problem. Whether it's one disciplinary form of knowledge, or one cultural standpoint, or one position in the world, will never be enough to solve our challenges.
Absolutely. Yeah, but that's maybe a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if we just relied on one form of knowledge, I'm not sure we want to go where that would take us.
I don't think that's the trajectory of the world.
So let's
Or
see
science
that as a
communication.
strength of science communication.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much,
Thank
Sujatha.
you. Thanks.